Hello everybody, hope you're all having a great day. So today, I would like to teach you a little bit about code splitting. What it is, when you should use it, why you should use it, and how you would actually go about implementing it. So first off, what is code splitting? Code splitting is a method used in web development that defers to loading certain pieces of code until they are actually needed. By deferring loading this code, we effectively split that code out of our main bundle that's sent to the user when they first try to use our app. That piece of code that was split out of our main bundle is then put into another bundle that is sent to the user after they perform some interaction, such as going to a new route or opening a different menu or clicking on a button on our app. Now, why is this useful? Well, it is useful because by decreasing the amount of code that is needed when the user first goes into our app, we can significantly improve load times as there is less JS that needs to be sent over the network. Now, why is code splitting useful? Well, it is useful because by decreasing the amount of code that is needed when the user first goes into our app, we can significantly improve load times as there's less JS that needs to be sent over the network and less JS for the browser to parse and compile. So we kind of get a 2-for-1 performance boost by doing code splitting. This effectively means that having less code in our bundle gives us better performance. And again, this is for two reasons. One is that since we have less JS in our bundles, then we have less code that the user needs to download for our app. Having less code means it'll take less time for the code to get to the user, which is much more important for users with slower download speeds. The second reason is that having less code sent to the user means that there is less code for the browser to parse and compile. This is then a significant saver of CPU processing time. Again, we get a 2-for-1 performance boost. This may be a bit easier to see with an example. Let's say we have a blog app where users can write their own posts and share them, put tags in them to indicate what the post is about, people can follow certain topics or tags, etc., etc. Let your imagination go wild. And let's say that our app only needs 3 routes. The homepage route, indicated by this slash here, the settings route, indicated by this slash settings here, and the post route, indicated by this slash post route, or by this slash post here. So now this chart here indicates how much of the total bundle size each route takes up. So the slash route would take up this block of code, the slash post route would take up this block here, and the slash settings route would take up this block here. This would be the relative percentage of how much code each route takes up for in the main bundle. So, like I said, the post route has its own section, the home page route has its own section, and the settings route has its own section. Now to clarify, most bundle analyzers won't give you the size of each route, but if you do something like have a separate container for each route, like have a post container, have an application container, have a settings container, and you use that using something like React Router, you've basically done the same thing. Moving on now, we can see that our main route takes up most of the bundle size, as we would expect, but the post route and the settings route take up quite a bit as well. So let's say that we decide to code split out the entire slash settings route. We would end up with something like this, where now we have 2 bundles instead of 1. We have this bundle slash main.js and this bundle slash settings.js. And our main.js bundle is the bundle that we would send to the user on load because it has, all the code needed for the homepage route. And we would only send the settings bundle when they go to the settings route. Why? Because they don't need the settings code until they go to the settings route. And once they do, then, obviously they need that code, so we would send it to them so they can actually use the whatever's on that settings route. But now to clarify once again, if they were to go directly to the settings route, we would have to send both this bundle and this bundle. But more often than not, they would go straight to the home route, and then later on, if they really needed to, they would go to the settings route. And then once it goes to the settings route, we would send them this settings bundle. But this is pretty clearly a pretty significant gain for us, a performance gain for us, because we took out a big chunk of code here from our main bundle. Instead of sending all this together on load, we only send this chunk and defer sending this chunk until later on, until they actually need it. And like I said before, this decreases the amount of code that the user needs to download and also decreases the amount of code that the browser needs to parse and compile. So instead of having to download, parse, and compile all of this code, the user and the browser only has to download and parse and compile this amount of code. Now this type of code splitting is known as route-based code splitting because, as the name suggests, we are splitting out code based on the route. So we just split out everything in the slash settings route. Now, there is another type of code splitting called component-based code splitting, and when used effectively, it can give a huge performance gain and can improve the perceived load time of the app. In this type of code splitting, we don't just split out an entire chunk of code based on its route. Rather, we split out a large component within the code that may not be needed until later. Now, this may sound very similar to route-based code splitting, so let's see an example. So using our same app from before, our cool blog that has our home page, our post route, and our settings route that are actually code split out already, let's say that our post route is pretty basic. Apart from this big complex rich text editor that is also a markdown editor that also uses emoji pickers and font pickers and image pickers and any other picker you can think of that would add content to a blog post. Obviously this sounds like a huge component, and that's evidence here as it takes out most of the post route. However, that is about all this route needs. All we do is just type in this editor and then hit post. So let's say that it uses the universal header that we use in our homepage route and our settings route, and then beneath that header, we just have this complex editor. This would be a perfect use case for component-based code splitting. Why? Well, again, all that route needs is that universal header in the editor. So if we just split out the editor, the header would render almost instantly since it's already downloaded, parsed, and compiled, because even if the user went to the home route, well, they need that universal header. And then since it would render instantly, that would give us great perceived load time, and the editor will load in and render shortly thereafter. So the route appears to load almost instantly, apart from waiting for that editor. Now we just split out the editor, and we're left with something that looks like this. Now, combined with our route-based code splitting of the settings page, as we can see here, we have three bundles: the main bundle, the settings.js bundle, and the rich text.js bundle. But we also have significantly reduced the size of the main bundle. We went from having all this together in one giant bundle to having, well, now only this this bit here that we need to send. And thus, we have significantly improved the load time of the main bundle, aka the one that users need to go onto our app in the first place, by, well, code splitting, by removing or cutting down on the amount of code that the user needs to download and that the browser needs to parse and compile. Again, instead of having this giant chunk all together, we're sending them small little fractions at a time, based on what they really need at that moment. Now, you may be wondering, when should you use code splitting, and how should you know which one to use? You might be a bit confused whether you should use route-based or whether you should use component-based. You may also be confused as to exactly what to code split out. Well, let's go over that. So let's start off with when to use it. The simplest answer I can give is that you should use code splitting when you have a large chunk of code that users don't really need in order to use the basics of your app. In our example, we saw that users didn't need the complex editor right away, so we split it out. We also figured that most users would be going directly to our home route, not to the settings or post route. And think about it for a minute. If you want to check out your orders on Amazon, you don't go to amazon.com/orders or whatever the URL is. You more than likely go to Amazon, click on your previous orders, and click to view your orders. As simple as that. So we can make a pretty safe assumption that users won't be going to these two routes in our app directly that often. As a result, we code split out the settings route. Again, that is because users didn't need it right away to use the basics of our app. They only needed it if they chose to go to the settings page. And this code splitting likely has minimal performance on the load times of that settings page as well, while giving us a pretty solid boost on our main bundle. So my recommendation would be to use a bundle analyzer and take a look at the large chunks of your code. Play around with your app yourself as if you're a new user. If you realize that more often than not there are large chunks of code that you see in the analyzer that you don't use right away, then that might be a good candidate for code splitting. And now for a little bit of a less helpful answer, try it out. Gain some experience with it. Try code splitting out some bundles and some code in your own apps, or make a separate app with some complex pages and some really simple pages and a main page route, and start to get a feel for it. Once you get a feel for it, this will just come naturally. Now, let's go over which one to use. So this answer can be a little bit tricky, as oftentimes it may seem like it doesn't really matter whether you use route-based code splitting or component-based code splitting. Either way, you're just taking large chunks of your code out of your main bundle. But there are cases where you may want to use one over the other. For instance, let's say that you have a complex modal that's used in the homepage route or the slash route. You can't really perform route-based code splitting there since that's your main route, but you can still do component-based code splitting. Granted, that one was pretty obvious. Same goes for the case where you have a route that is rarely used, except in that case you'd use route-based code splitting. Now, let's say that in our settings page we have some simple settings, like your email, your name, and maybe we have a dark mode and a light mode, so you can toggle the color themes. And then let's say we have an advanced section, like you'd often see in things like Chrome settings page. And let's say that advanced section is pretty large and complex, but users can only get to that section if they click on a drop down or a button that enables it. That's where maybe users can set their favorite font, favorite emojis, maybe we let them set some snippets, add some shortcuts when writing blogs, things like that. That'll be a great candidate for component-based code splitting, because the simple settings are, well, small and simple, but the advanced settings are large and complex. We put it all the advanced settings into one giant or one large advanced settings container or advanced settings component, and we would have that split out. But we would still keep the slash settings route and the simple settings in our main bundle. That way our settings page will load incredibly quickly. If we were to code split out the entire settings page, we'd primarily be waiting on the advanced settings to load the route anyway, even though users may not even look at them. So we'd be code splitting out the entire route, still waiting on the same code that we'd be splitting out if we just did component-based code splitting from the beginning. So my recommendation would be to take a look at your code and decide for yourself whether the entire route is large and complex, and if so, then that might be a good case for route-based code splitting. Or if you find that only certain things on that route are complex, like our advanced settings in our example before, then you may be better off keeping that route in the main bundle, but instead code splitting out the components and the containers that are complex on that route. That way you maintain solid performance and load times when going between those routes. And also, a good principle to follow is generally that you should try to create as large of a component as possible to split out when doing component-based code splitting. That way you don't have the flashiness like I mentioned before. And this also comes down to this decision between route-based and component-based also comes down to the user experience you're looking to create. If you're really trying to focus on really good perceived load times, then maybe component-based code splitting would be best and not doing route-based code splitting. That way the routes can load pretty quickly initially, and then the rest of the stuff can kind of just fill in over as they load. But again, you want to code split out as large chunks of code as possible. You don't want to split out a bunch of little ones. This is because as they load, they're going to be loading individually if they're all split into little ones. And you might get flashiness. You get one component that loads, and another component, another component, another component. And that doesn't really look good, to be honest. It makes it look like it's flashing and it can be a little bit overwhelming. Whereas if you have it in one large container, you have all these, like in our advanced settings example, we had all these settings into one container. All that would load and render at the same time because it's all being loaded within this one large split out bundle. But again, play around with it, gain some experience with it, and this will start to come, like second nature. Maybe do exactly the opposite of what I said and do route based where you think component based might be good, or component based where you think route based might be good, and see what kind of drawbacks you have. Or maybe instead of doing, putting everything to one big container when you do component based code splitting, maybe just code split out a bunch of little components inside and see what happens. That way you can see what would be good as a user and what would be bad as a user. And you can gain more experience from there, and both of these decisions regarding when you should do it, when you should use code splitting, and what kind of code splitting you should use, they'll start to come second nature to you. Alright, so I've laid out most of the pros of code splitting. To recap, the main pro of code splitting is that it enables you to defer loading large chunks of code until they are actually needed, decreasing the load time of your app by decreasing the amount of JavaScript that is sent over to the user, and likewise decreasing the amount of code that the browser needs to parse and compile, resulting in a big performance boost. But what about the cons? Well, there's two main cons that I can think of. The first one is that if code splitting is not done right, it can make it look like your page is taking a while to load, as items can just flash in separately as they are downloaded, parsed, compiled, and rendered. I've talked about this quite a bit. For instance, let's say that we didn't combine all the advanced settings stuff in our previous example into one component, and let's say that the code we split out of the advanced setting route is downloaded and parsed and compiled separately. We would end up with a bunch of components that all need to be, rendered, and each one would render in separately as they are made available. This will make it look like each of the settings components are flashing onto the page instead of one large component that seamlessly loads everything in for the user. But still, I would say that as long as you're careful about how you're using code splitting, i.e. code splitting out large chunks of code instead of a bunch of small chunks, the pros will definitely outweigh the cons. So now you may be wondering, how do I actually do code splitting? Well, if you want to learn how to actually code split in your app by following along with code, tune into the next video on code splitting where I'll show you exactly how. Take care, have a great day. Bye bye.